I've lived on Maple Lane for 23 years. It's the kind of street where porches creak, mailboxes lean a little, and everyone waves when they drive by, or at least they used to, until last spring, until my name was whispered in the wrong kitchen, over the wrong cup of coffee. I've always been the quiet one, widowed at 56, retired school librarian, keeper of geraniums and polite smiles. People said I was nice, which is another way of saying they didn't really know me. And I was fine with that. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a police cruiser parked in front of my house. Two officers stepped out, one young enough to be my former student. He asked gently if I'd come outside for a moment. I remember the air smelled like lilacs and wet grass. I remember every neighbor's curtain twitching. And I remember thinking, this must be some mistake. They said a pair of antique candlesticks had gone missing from Helen Carter's home, my next-door neighbor, my Sunday baking companion, my supposed friend. And apparently she told them she had reason to believe I took them. I almost laughed. Until I saw Helen standing on her porch, arms crossed, mouth tight. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The officers were kind. They searched politely, found nothing, and left with awkward apologies. But the silence that followed was louder than any siren. Within days, I could feel it. The subtle shift in air when people pass you but don't greet you. The way conversations stop when you walk into the bakery. Even my mail started arriving later. Like the world itself was hesitating before coming to my door. I kept telling myself, the truth always surfaces. But truth moves slowly when gossip is fast. One evening I heard Helen's voice through our shared hedge. She was telling another neighbor she'd never really trusted me, that I always seemed a bit too private. I stood in my garden, hands in soil, and felt something inside me wilt. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do, and the silence hurt more than the accusation itself? That night, I took out my late husband's old notebook and wrote one line. Let them believe what they will. I will wait for truth to knock. I didn't know how or when it would happen. I just knew that life has a way of circling back, and that sometimes the loudest vindication comes quietly. A week after the officers left, my world got smaller. Helen stopped coming to our book club. The Smiths, who used to wave when they walked their dog, suddenly changed routes. Even the children who played ball in the cul-de-sac seemed to go quiet when I stepped outside. It wasn't the loss of reputation that hurt most. It was the loss of belonging. I had lived on that street for more than 2 decades, watched their children grow, delivered casseroles when someone was ill, and now I was the ghost of Maple Lane. For days I tried to tell myself it would pass, but the stares, the whispers, the way Helen's blinds always closed when I went out for mail, it started to gnaw at me. I would find footprints near my side gate as if someone was checking to see whether I'd hidden something. One afternoon, I found a note on my porch. No envelope, just folded paper with neat cursive letters. We thought you were better than this. No name, no courage to face me directly. I sat down on the steps and stared at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. The hands of someone who had built a life carefully, only to watch it crumble with a whisper. 3 days later, I went to Helen's. I knocked gently. When she opened the door, her eyes flickered with something between guilt and pride. "Can we talk?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "I don't think that's a good idea." "Helen," I said softly, "you know me." I thought I did. Her voice trembled, but her chin stayed lifted. Behind her, I could see her kitchen, the same place we used to drink tea every Friday. The teapot I'd given her for Christmas still sat on the counter. Funny how objects stay loyal even when people don't. She closed the door. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too still. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to tick slower, as if time itself was watching what they'd done to me. So I began writing everything down, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Dates, words, small details. If I couldn't make them believe me now, I would leave a record for the day they needed to. Weeks turned into months. My garden bloomed beautifully that summer, though no one came to admire it. And then, one afternoon in July, I heard it. A knock on my door. 3 soft taps. When I opened it, it wasn't Helen. It was her daughter, Lily. She couldn't have been more than 25. Hair tied up, nervous smile. "Mrs. Porter," she said quietly, "may I come in?" Her voice carried that mix of shame and courage you only hear when someone's about to undo something heavy. We sat at my kitchen table, 2 cups of tea between us. She looked down at her hands and said, "I think I know what happened to my mother's candlesticks." I didn't breathe. Tell me in the comments, have you ever known the truth was close, but didn't dare reach for it? Lily explained that her brother, David, had borrowed them months ago for a college photography project. He'd wrapped them in a blanket and stored them in his car trunk, and forgotten. When the police arrived, Helen panicked. Instead of checking with her son, she blamed the easiest person to suspect, the quiet widow next door. Lily said she'd only found out after David came home for the summer, saw the posts on their neighborhood Facebook group, and confessed. I sat there, silent, letting every word sink in. Not anger, just a deep, aching sadness. "Does your mother know you're here?" I asked. She nodded. "She doesn't want to face you, but she told me to tell you she's sorry." I looked at that young woman, her mother's eyes, her father's posture, and realized how cycles of hurt pass quietly between generations. "She doesn't have to say it," I said softly. "But I hope one day she learns what forgiveness really feels like." That night, I placed fresh flowers on my porch, not as a peace offering, but as a declaration. My peace was mine again. And I knew it wasn't over yet, because the truth had knocked, and now it had to walk through the neighborhood that once whispered my name. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds and something else. Voices outside. When I looked through the blinds, I saw Helen standing in her driveway, talking to Mrs. Smith from across the street. For the first time in months, she looked small. Her hands moved nervously as she spoke, eyes darting toward my house. By noon, the whispers had started again, but this time they sounded different. Around 3 o'clock, I heard another knock at the door. This time, it was Helen. She stood there holding a small box wrapped in tissue paper. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I don't know what to say," she began. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "Start with hello,"
I said softly. She let out a shaky laugh, the first real sound I had heard from her in months. "Hello," she whispered. She handed me the box. Inside were the 2 silver candlesticks, a little tarnished but still gleaming. "I found them in David's car. He told me everything." I nodded, letting the silence stretch long enough for her to feel it. Sometimes silence teaches better than words ever can. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I was so sure, and I didn't even check. I thought—" "I don't know what I thought." I met her eyes. "You thought the quiet one was the easiest one to blame." Her lip trembled. Tears pooled, then fell. "I ruined your name," she whispered. "Everyone believed me." Yes, they did. We stood in my doorway for a long time. I could have asked for an apology in front of the neighborhood, a post online, a letter to the police, but I didn't want a public confession. What I wanted was something smaller, something truer. "I forgive you, Helen," I said. Her shoulders shook. "How can you?" "Because I don't want to live in the same prison that guilt built for you." Tell me in the comments, have you ever forgiven someone not because they asked, but because your peace was worth more than their apology? She nodded, still crying, and left the box on my table. That evening, I polished the candlesticks until they gleamed. Not as trophies, but as reminders that truth doesn't need to shout to be seen. Later that week, I went to the local market.
It was my first real trip into town since everything happened. At the checkout line, Mrs. Smith from across the street approached me. She looked awkward, clutching a loaf of bread like it was a shield. "Margaret," she began quietly, "I'm sorry we should have—" I smiled gently. "It's all right." She hesitated. "You're coming to the neighborhood brunch next month, right?" I hadn't planned to, but I could see in her eyes this wasn't just an invitation. It was an attempt to rewrite the silence. "I'll bring my blueberry pie," I said. When I got home, I placed the candlesticks on my mantel, one on each side of my husband's photograph. For the first time, I lit them both. Their twin flames flickered in the glass, glowing soft gold across the room. And I realized something. When truth finally comes home, it doesn't erase the hurt. It just makes the air easier to breathe again. That night, I wrote another line in my husband's notebook. "Vindication doesn't roar. It whispers, then rests." And for the first time in months, I slept without the weight of watching my own name burn in other people's mouths. It's been nearly a year since Helen stood on my porch with that small box in her hands. The seasons have turned over, slow and gentle. The kind of passing that reminds you healing doesn't come with applause, only with time. The lilacs bloomed again this spring. I still keep them trimmed neatly along the fence that divides our yards. And sometimes when Helen walks by with her dog, she'll pause, offer a faint smile and say, "They look lovely this year." I smile back. We don't speak of the past, and maybe that's mercy too. At the next neighborhood brunch, I brought my blueberry pie like I promised. People welcomed me the way they used to, maybe even a little warmer, like they'd remembered something they'd lost. Mrs. Smith hugged me too tightly. Her husband helped carry my dish to the table. Even the children, who used to avoid my yard, came by later that week to return the basketball that had rolled into my garden.
I didn't need their apologies anymore. The truth had already done its quiet work. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch when Lily stopped by again. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note written in Helen's shaky handwriting. I hope one day I can be the kind of woman you are, one who forgives what others can't take back. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter and placed it in my husband's notebook, between the pages where I'd once written, "Let them believe what they will. I will wait for truth to knock." Tell me in the comments, have you ever realized that forgiveness isn't about who deserves it, but about who needs peace most? Later that evening, I watched the sunset spill through my window. The light hit the candlesticks on the mantel, and for a moment, the room filled with gold. I thought about how something that once symbolized accusation now stood as proof of grace. People ask me sometimes why I never moved after all that happened, why I stayed on a street that turned its back on me. And I always say the same thing, because this is my home, and you don't abandon what you've forgiven. The truth has a way of finding its way to the right door, no matter how long it takes. Sometimes it knocks softly. Sometimes it waits until you're ready to open it. For me, it came on an ordinary summer afternoon, wearing the face of a young woman with her mother's eyes. And from that moment on, the silence that once accused me became the silence that healed me. These days, when I sit on my porch and hear the neighbors chatting, I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude, because the same people who doubted me also taught me what it means to be sure of yourself, even when no one else is. And when dusk falls, I light those same 2 candlesticks, not for what was lost, but for what was found: truth, forgiveness, and the peace that comes after both. Because here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. Subscribe, stay with us, and help the silence end one true story at a time.